Voters in France head to the polls on Sunday to choose their next president. After a spate of attacks, the country is on high alert and security a big concern. How much will it influence then the people's choice at the ballot box? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. French voters go to the polls on Sunday to elect a new president in what's being described as the most uncertain election ever in French politics. And the world is watching, because this election will not only have an impact within France, but beyond its borders. Now, here's why. Well, France is the second largest economy in the Eurozone and one of the 7 biggest across the world. A couple of candidates have already talked about a Frexit, leaving the European Union. And not just that, this election takes place at a time when the French people are increasingly worried about security after several attacks across the country, the latest taking place on Thursday during the candidates' final TV debate. Could this latest incident help swing the pendulum in favour of the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen? Will the popular nationalist fervour sweeping other countries around the globe take hold in France? Far-right candidate Marine Le Pen has kept the National Front's strong anti-immigrant views. She wants France out of Europe and has been critical of the country's large Muslim population. Republican François Fillon was the front-runner, but his campaign has been dogged by claims he used state funds to pay his wife and children for jobs they didn't do. He favours cuts to public spending. He's also pushing for mosques to be monitored. Well, Fillon's troubles have boosted newcomer and centrist Emmanuel Macron. He's a fierce defender of open immigration and supports the European Union. And then there's Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who left the Socialists to start his own far-left party. He's critical of NATO and is promising to reform the EU. Let's bring our guests into the show. We have in Paris Jacques Reland, a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. In London, Olivier Guitat, security and political risk analyst and the managing director of Global Strat. And also in Paris, Nathalie Goulet, senator representing Haute-Normandie in France. Good to have you all. Let's start, if we may, with Jacques. Is security now the top issue in this election?
It was not during the campaign, but it has become the top issue in the last few days, following the revelation that a potential attack against candidates could happen before the election, and some people were arrested in Marseille a few days ago. And obviously, the events of last night, the announcement at the time on television when all the candidates were answering questions about their program, suddenly that, with many viewers, that brought the issue to the fore of the campaign in the last few days. In the last few days, the campaign stops tonight officially. So it could be, and many people think that it might be a game changer, or at least it will have some impact, at least on the voting.
Okay, that's a good point and a good time for me to transition into Nathalie. So the picture's changing, Jacques says there. Do you think by the time the voters go to those polls, it's going to be about security, economy, unemployment, all of those issues will be taking a back seat?
Well, you know, those issues should have been head of the schedule. Unfortunately, the affairs went on, and then we didn't have a real campaign on the basis, but, you know, the fight against terrorism was always in the air. I mean, it's not brand new, but it took a new way by the attack of yesterday, of course.
Let's bring Olivier into it. From a security perspective, France, of course, has witnessed a number of attacks. Does the latest one in any way, Olivier, change or add anything new to the security challenge France is facing?
No, not really, because if you look at the number of attacks that French security services have foiled since the beginning of the year, we're talking about 7 in just 3 months. So the amount of potential terrorist attacks that are facing France has gone really up since January 2015, and we have now a situation where France is at the top of the food chain, if you will, of jihadist groups, and it's far from a surprise for many people within the country that unfortunately this happened last night.
So far from a surprise. Let me go back to Nathalie. Do you agree with that then? Why are we thinking that this will be the top issue? Will it impact people really when they go to the polls, if people are becoming used to the fact that unfortunately there are attacks like this?
No, may I tell you something? We are never ready, and we are not used to terrorism, and we always want to fight it. But at the same time, our intelligence services were absolutely aware and told everybody, including the press, that this election was also a question with a high level of insecurity and threat. So somebody were expecting something. We were expecting something, except that yesterday was absolutely unpredictable. We didn't know where and who. But we are still on the under a state of emergency, may I remind you. So this question of security was always in the air. I mean, even the people were not talking about it, but during the different speeches, we had this issue all the time.
Okay, then I guess the question is, Jacques, are we going to see security concerns translate into increased support for the right wing of French politics? What do you think, Jacques?
That's what one would assume at the time, because you think that people like Le Pen and especially François Fillon have made the issue of terrorism, especially Islamist terrorism, the top issue for them. Let's not forget that François Fillon wrote a book about Islam terrorism. And therefore, for him, it could be an opportunity to bring that back, to bring the fact that he has focused on that issue, which was not actually dealt with that much during the campaign, as was said earlier, because people have now, you could say, they've now become accustomed. At the same time, terrorism, we know that we'll have to live with it. We know that terrorism can strike anywhere. We've seen it striking in Sweden, we've seen it striking in England, in Germany, everywhere. And most of the time, last time, it's been due to some lone wolves, rather than big, well-organized attacks, such as the one on Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan a couple of years ago.
Jacques, let me jump in here. You used the expression that one would think that a rise in security concerns would mean more support from the right wing, and it's interesting you used that word, one would think so, or that's what we would think. But there are polls that say that after the Paris attack in November 2015 or after the Bastille attack in July 2016, there was not an increase in support for the National Front leader in the polls. Let me take that point back to Nathalie and say, how certain are some of these assumptions which are being made?
Well, you know, Marine Le Pen is surfing on the wave, and so is François Fillon. Because she has been working on this issue, and she has been pleading this hell of Islamophobia for such a long time. So now she looks right, and so she did a very strong speech this morning, and it was very scary for the Republican and for the people who love the democracy and multiculturalism. But at the same time, you know, it's something that the people want to listen to. Mm-hmm. And you also have to face that now the French population, most part of them are really scared, and they are listening very carefully what Marine Le Pen is saying, unfortunately.
Okay, people are scared. Perhaps a good time to ask Olivier the question, will security be stepped up? Is it going to look any different now for Sunday? Will fear of those attacks, the scared scenario that Nathalie is pointing out there, is it going to dampen voter turnout, do you think?
I don't think so. I mean, looking first at your point regarding the security to be stepped up, it has already been stepped up to the max level. We're talking about 50,000 soldiers and police put on the streets of France in the past 2 weeks. In the run-up to those elections. So there's not much that the state can do to protect people from terror attacks. Then the second question that you're asking, the fear factor, I think if yesterday's attack was much more bloodier and was targeting soft target in a way, in a fashion that it was in November 2015, I would put to you that it would put more fear into the minds of people, and it could translate into a better score for François Fillon and Marine Le Pen. I think that because of yesterday's modus operandi and target, this will have a limited impact on the voters on Sunday.
Well, talking about the far-right French presidential candidate Marine Le Pen, she says war has been declared on France. She's calling for a wide range of measures which would take the French nation perhaps in a different direction. Border checks to be reinstated, the country too exposed, she says.
Je lui demande solennellement.
We have to get rid of the Schengen zone. We have to fortify our borders and combat those who are our enemies. We have to accelerate measures to strip people who are terrorists or suspected terrorists of their nationality. We have to recruit 50,000 more police officers. We have to reinforce international cooperation, military cooperation, and make sure all our resources are mobilized against these terrorists, because we're talking about war here.
And the French Conservative candidate François Fillon also talking about building walls, arguing security needs to be the top priority for the next president.
Certains n'ont, semble-t-il, pas encore totalement.
Some, it would seem, haven't actually taken stock of the evil which is confronting us, and I am determined to do that with an iron fist. My top priority would be that it is the real priority of the next 5 years that we will be inflexibly determined, and we will be absolutely resolute. We have to rearm, re-equip the security forces and military, but also strengthen ideologically and culturally, because Islam is a challenge to our very culture and values.
All right, I can see, Nathalie, you're shaking your head in disagreement. Let me give you a chance to come in on this.
Well, you know, listening to Marine Le Pen, and we don't recognize our country. We don't want any kind of this politic. And then I have to underline something which is really important, and that people and public have to know, is when we try to implement some new regulation against terrorism, or the passenger name record, PNR, or any kind of tool, all the deputies and senators from the National Front never vote a single measure against terrorism. They are against everything, and now they are yelling to get and collect ballot, and at the same time, when they sit in the parliament, including European Parliament, they don't vote anything. So, you know, it's a kind, they just cheat, and they just surf on the web of fear and Islamophobia, and anything which is law like that will help them to collect ballot, and it's exactly less, of course. The same thing for François Fillon, who is also using this file, which is Islamophobia or Organization of Islam or anything linked with Islam, to try to collect ballot and surf on the wave of fear. And it's really unfair, and it's not good for the French society.
All right, Jacques there, the fear of Muslims, the fear of open borders, fear of the EU. You listen to some of the statements coming out of François Fillon and Marine Le Pen, and it sounds like the calls for France to almost close up on itself are getting louder, are they?
They're getting louder from some camps. Obviously, on the part of François Fillon and Marine Le Pen, is because they're in a state of despair. They think that maybe this election, they're going to lose this election. So they're ready to ride or to surf on any issue that could help them to provoke a state of fear in the population. I think they're exploiting it. And, well, as I said, if you look at the facts, you know that there's not been anything in France happening, any concerted attack in France since July 2016. We know that the security services have been completely reorganized and are now more efficient and have foiled many attempts, as I mentioned earlier, the last one in Marseille. And when you talk about closing the borders, let's not forget that many of these attacks have been carried out by French nationals who did not cross border. And actually, when you talk about Europe, not closing the borders, it means you would also lose your connections with other European intelligence services, maybe, and that has been a key factor in foiling some attacks, such as the one which led to the arrest of the 2 people in Marseille. That the information came from British intelligence. Yesterday there was information coming from Belgian police to let France know that one suspect was meant to be going to Paris. As it turned out, it was not quite right. But the funny thing is that the Daesh statement mentioned Belgian terrorists while it was actually a Frenchman. Then the other measure consisting in arresting all the people who have been fiché, we say, who have been recorded, who have been spotted as potentially radical, to arrest them, judge them. Sometimes Marine Le Pen would put them in jail. That would be totally counterproductive, because actually it's through surveillance of these suspects that the police and the security services have been able to fight the terrorist threat.
You've raised a bunch of good points there, Jacques. Let me, if I may, take them to Olivier. So far we know that, for example, in this most recent attack, the suspect is a French national. Would clamping down on immigration, would somehow withdrawing from the EU, would any of those sorts of measures have prevented an attack like this?
The one from yesterday, definitely not. I mean, as one of your guests mentioned, 95% of the attacks in France were perpetrated by Frenchmen. The only 2 cases we had is those Syrians that came at the Stade de France and passed as refugees. And the closing of borders, I think, will not have any impact. I mean, the main issue here is to get the intelligence from anyone that is close to the circle. So it means, penetration of networks, getting information from the communities, getting information from other countries.
Olivier, what about rounding people up, as Marine Le Pen has advocated, the sorts of, as Jacques termed them there, the fishy characters, round them up and put them in jail? Does that help a security situation, or is that counterproductive?
That would not help. I mean, she talked about deporting the foreign people that are on this list. I suggest that most of them are Frenchmen. And as I said, it has to be done, with a velvet glove. And the way to do it is to get more than often intelligence. I think that what would be very important is to get people that are close to potential terrorists to come forward and to feel confident to speak to the police, to know that, as a good citizen, protecting one's own when it comes to violence is not the way to go.
Nathalie, is this really a crucial moment, perhaps, in the choice or the struggle, however you want to see it, between globalization and popularism?
Well, but just let me tell you something. First of all, we have to act. When I start to work on the foreign fighters, we had 2,000 people on the verge of radicalization in France. Now there are more than 14,000 people on the verge of radicalization. And I have to tell you something, and that is a fact. 40% of them are converts from Christian into Muslim for the sake of radicalization and fighting and terrorism. So it's a question which is very important. It's a French national, sometimes convert. Then regarding the way that we have to solve that, we have to do it under the judge power, the judiciary power. There is no way that we will implement in this country a Patriot Act. We don't want anything. We have our state of law. We are now under a state of emergency, and we don't want anything close to the Patriot Act. That is clear. Now, to answer your question, we are in a globalization, and we have to do that. But what we have to do is rebuild a citizen link between the citizens. You cannot stigmatize a Muslim all the time and expect them not to go back to communitarism. We have a real problem in this French society. The French society is hurt. The French society is scary. The French society is under an economic pressure. And so we have some very, very deep problem, and it's not by pushing more criminal regulation and more crazy proposals that we will solve the problem. It's all the contrary.
All right, well, talking about measured responses, centrist Emmanuel Macron agreed security is a top priority, but advocates a more considered response.
Que vous avez à faire dimanche prochain doit être un choix d'avenir.
The choice you need to make this Sunday is a choice for the future. Do not give in to fear, to division, intimidation and bullying. Our generation must meet that challenge by rallying together and building a new reality around a progressive project. We have to have a mechanism that protects us from terrorism, and we need to transform our society through education, culture and work. I know the French people are not frightened.
Jacques, despite that sort of call, the rise of Mélenchon as a candidate has left some people predicting that the second round is going to look like Le Pen on one hand and Mélenchon on the other. Is France heading towards extremes?
I don't believe that. No, I don't believe that at all. I think, yes, Mélenchon has been going up in the polls. There's some degree of resentment in the population. Some people are very angry. But I, for one, can tell you that the second round will not be Mélenchon against Le Pen. And I can also, if I want to say, I can affirm that Le Pen will not be the next president of France. Obviously, the terrorists are voting for Le Pen or maybe Fillon. By doing this act yesterday, they wanted to create divisions in French society, which they would wanted to push the government to forget the future government or the candidates, to forget all about our democratic principles. They wanted to actually increase, to make Islamophobia stronger in the country in order to motivate Muslims into jihad, because they would then be discriminated against even more than they already are. So it's quite clear that if one is definitely interested in a peaceful, successful France, it cannot be based on the politics of fear. And that's why I think Emmanuel Macron is right to remind people that let's keep calm. We've had worse events than that. One of the great things about France, one thing that has reassured me, is how calmly the population has reacted to the Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan attacks. We've seen recently an indicator showing that tolerance of other races, of Islam, has increased in France, and racism has gone down in the last couple of years. And I think that's a credit to the current government, who played a big part in keeping things calm.
All right, I think we've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to give 1 minute to Nathalie before we have a final minute with Olivia. Nevertheless, Nathalie, how unprecedented is it that we're even talking about a scenario perhaps in which the two major parties in French politics may not, in the reading of some people, even be in the second round of voting, that we may be talking about France putting out of the EU, that we may be talking about a realignment of relations with Russia and so on and so on?
Well, I think that for the first time in history, we need more fortune tellers and political analysis, because we really don't know. But what is for sure is that the political party, the way that the political life is organized in France is totally dead. And I think that the fact for the major party to organize primary, despite the fact that it's not our cultural matter to do, brought us where we are. Means in predictable time. Okay,
I think we've got only about 30 seconds left. So, Olivia, given everything I just asked to Nathalie there, is the European security map also at stake in this French election?
No, not really. I mean, at this point, cooperation has gone up between European countries. So, and even Britain has helped, and I think it's very telling that even with Brexit, I think the cooperation between, for instance, the UK and France will continue.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Let's thank all of our guests, Olivia Guita, Jacques Reland and Nathalie Goulet. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, AlJazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.